I'm observing that there's an awakening happening within the Christian world of people. God's touching people's hearts with a heart for his heart, with zeal for his house, with the desire to understand and know more about it. And it's a really exciting thing that's taking place. I think it's even more than just the nation of Israel's hearts turning. I think it requires the hearts of the nations to turn as well. And I really believe that if we in the nations really understood what the temple would mean for us, what the temple would mean for somebody living in South Africa, or for someone living in New Zealand or Papua New Guinea, or Denver, Colorado, where I come from. If we really understood the significance of the temple and how profoundly it would transform our world, everybody would come here right now and demand that it would be restored.
Welcome to the Temple Mount Report. Today I have a wonderful, wonderful friend who is here today to talk about his passion for the Temple Mount, coming from a Christian background, and how he got connected with the issue of the Temple Mount, how this subject has been speaking to him, and how he's been engaging with many Christians around the world on this very issue, bringing celebrities, bringing Christian leaders up on the Temple Mount, explaining to them the importance of the Temple Mount from a Christian and from somebody who has really spent many of his years here in the land of Israel, on the front lines with the Jewish people in Judea, Samaria, and has been working as a volunteer for one of the most impactful organizations here in the land of Israel called Hayovel. And so for my special guest today, I really want to encourage you to really listen in to what he has to say, because I guarantee you that he is going to have something very important for you to hear, and that is going to really speak to you. Because my good friend Aaron Murphy has a passion and a zeal for the Temple Mount, for sure.
And I do.
And I think that's one of the things that we want to talk about today. How did you get involved with the Temple Mount? How did this subject, how to say, caught you, and why is it that you're so involved with this?
Yeah, so the Temple Mount, the call of the temple really grabbed a hold of me a number of years ago. I'll tell you the story of how it happened. I was driving down the road in a white 15-passenger van, and in the Colorado countryside, it was like a nice winter day, just enjoying everything. And sitting next to me was my good friend Joshua Waller, one of the deeply involved with the operation of Hayovel. And we had a gentleman that we had met earlier that day at like a presentation that we had done, who was hoping to join us over in Israel for one of our volunteer trips for the pruning. And Joshua was sharing with him about what to expect when coming over to Israel, and what that experience would be like for him. And so we're just driving along. I'm just enjoying listening to their conversation. All of a sudden, there's this big bang in the back of the vehicle. And so I pull over to the side of the road real quickly. We jump out to see what happened, and our rear tire had blown. So we just quickly set about getting that tire fixed. And eventually the previous conversation picked back up again. And Joshua just told this gentleman that one of the things that would take place during our volunteer trips is we would be having a devotion message every morning during breakfast. And the guy's like, hey, that sounds really great. I just have one request. Don't talk about the restoration of the temple. And so Joshua began to kind of like answer that question. And I just had to jump in there, and I was like, what's the deal? What do you mean don't talk about the temple, the rebuilding of the temple, or any of those type of things? And he's like, fine, tell me, why should I as a Christian care about the rebuilding of the temple? And to be honest, I hadn't really thought that seriously about the topic before this time. And so I just kind of began running through my mind. It's like everything just kind of froze for a minute. I'm like, what do I say? So I was, I grabbed a verse or two, and I was getting ready to share them. But I realized, I don't feel like I'm fully equipped to give a good, solid answer for this. Yeah, I can give them, some kind of answer, but it's not really the answer that this deserves.
It's not going to satisfy what you're trying to discuss here.
Exactly, yeah.
It's going to be a very shallow answer?
Shallow answer. It's like, because I hadn't studied it, it wasn't really something I knew about a whole lot about. So I committed in...
What year was this, by the way?
This was 2013.
Okay.
Yeah, 2012, 2013 timeframe. And so I told him, so I committed in my mind right at that moment that I was going to study this topic out, study the temple, like why should we as Christians be interested in the temple or the Temple Mount? And right at that moment, bam, I woke up. It was actually a dream. And I woke up, I was back in Har Bracha, here in Israel on the Mount of Blessing. And it was my first Sabbath back in the land of Israel. And I had this resounding phrase just going through my mind: zeal for your house has eaten him up, or zeal for your house consumes him. And this phrase was just resounding through my mind. And I look over at my clock, and it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and there's like no way I'm going back to sleep. And I actually dove in and started doing this study right then. So that's really what, how many years ago is that now? Like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, that really kicked off my interest in cultivating a zeal for God's house. And I really dove into the topic as Christians, is to look at where did Yeshua, what was his position relating to the temple? Because I figured, if he wasn't very zealous or into the temple, then maybe we shouldn't be either.
Right.
And, the more I dug into that, I see over and over, as you go through the Gospels, it seems like we see Jesus is there from a very young age when he's an infant, His parents bring him up to the temple. We see him there in his youth and throughout his ministry. He's there a lot, He's even there. We just finished celebrating the festival of Hanukkah. We see in John him being in the temple, during the wet, winter, rainy season. He made the trek all the way down from Nazareth to be there in the temple for the feast that celebrates the temple.
Which is not one of the high holy days. So that's actually an important fact, I think, what you just brought up there, because if Jesus did not care about the Temple Mount, if for him this was not an important subject, and for his followers, then quite clearly that would be kind of a perfect ideal moment or feast, holiday, which as far as I know was not, it's not a biblical feast.
Right.
Okay? And so they're still probably deciding, are we going to really celebrate this? Is this going to be some major...
is this something that's going to carry on for generations, or is this, just a nice thing?
And so here you have what is basically an added feast or an added holiday in Judaism that Jesus himself basically says, Hanukkah is important, and he makes an effort. For those who don't know, going from Nazareth all the way up to Jerusalem is not an easy trek, especially not in those days. Right. You didn't get in your 8-seater van or whatever, and just drive up to the Temple Mount.
And especially that time of year with the rains and snow. It's not the ideal walking weather,
For sure.
So
I think that's an important fact that you just pointed out there, for sure.
Because we see, throughout the Gospels, we see, Jesus in the temple. There for the festivals, for the 3 festivals, Pentecost or Shavuot, Passover, and Sukkot, the Festival of Tabernacles. We see different times where Jesus is there in the temple teaching during those feasts, but we see him outside of those times as well, like in this case. Then,
correct. Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then you start to study the issue of the Temple Mount. You start to get into it, because up until this point, besides a dream, you really didn't have a grasp or a real understanding of the Temple Mount, how it related to you as a Christian. And I think that's very significant, because a lot of our audience is a Christian audience. We're trying to reach out to the Christians and to combat a lot of the misconceived ideas that they have about the Temple Mount. Right? What are some of the big challenges you discovered as you were studying the issue of the Temple Mount, at least for yourself?
Yeah, so I remember one of the first times I went up onto the Temple Mount, and I don't remember, I think this might have been before I had the dream, maybe right around the same time, but I went up on the Temple Mount just kind of haphazardly, just walking around wherever, and afterwards I felt like that's not really right. Like, this is a very holy place. We look in Ezekiel, refers to the entire mountaintop as Kodesh Kodeshim, or Holy of Holies. So it's a very holy spot. And so I actually didn't go up to the Temple Mount for a year or two, just because I didn't feel like just going up there haphazardly. Like, I knew it was really important, but I didn't know how to. I felt like I needed to prepare before going up there, but I didn't really know how do I go about doing that. So from there I began having just conversations with Jewish friends and finding out more about, the laws that they observe when they go up to the Temple Mount. Just educating myself and becoming more aware of its significance, because I realized, that it's a holy place and I want to treat it with reverence. Respect the sanctity of God's holy mountain.
So you're telling me, as a Christian, you went to get advice from Jews about how to approach the Temple Mount?
Yeah, because I realized that in our Christian world, like, the temple isn't something we've really studied. We have a few teachings here and there, but for the most part, we really don't know very much about it. Try and look in the Christian world for information about the temple, and it's fairly limited.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of Christian theology which says the temple is done away with, it's no longer important, and because of that, there's just a real lack of information available on the topic, especially when you're coming at it saying, like, I recognize that this is a holy place that Jesus was zealous about, and that needs to be respected. How do I go about doing that? And so I learned that through my Jewish friends.
Right. And so then what was the next thing for you, would you say, that was an important aha moment, so to speak?
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do when I go up onto the Temple Mount is really connect to Jesus in the different times that he was up there, as well as the disciples, to connect to their experience on the Temple Mount. And one of those that I found very meaningful, we see it's one of the few accounts that's recorded in all four of the Gospels. It's when Jesus goes up on the Temple Mount and he cleanses it.
Right.
And, a lot of times I think we look at that and we're like, okay, it's Jesus is up there, he's making a whip, he's driving animals out, flipping tables over, like, it's very un-Christ-like behavior. It's like, whoa, what's going on here? And so I really enjoy digging into that and understanding more of, like, why was he doing that?
Right.
And what had happened is we had the Sadducean leaders of the day in Jerusalem were very corrupt. And Jesus comes there just before Passover, and not only are the Sadducees, up to their normal business of charging crazy amounts for the, approved sacrifices, but they've relocated the sacrificial market up onto the Temple Mount itself. And that is apparently something that maybe some people were thinking was okay, but Jesus definitely did not think that it was okay. I kind of see him...
Just to clarify, they obviously put the market not in a holy space up on the Temple Mount, per se.
Correct, yeah.
Right. So I think that's also important to understand the location.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So where they brought the marketplace up to was in, like, the court of the nations. It was outside. It wasn't in the holy space, the 500 cubits that we see talked about in the Mishnah as being like the holy place on the mountain. Right. But I almost see Jesus' behavior there, or his ruling essentially on the issue, is in alignment with Ezekiel, because Ezekiel talks about the entire mountaintop being holy of holies. Right. So I see Jesus actually treating the entire mountaintop, while other people are like, it's not part of the 500 cubits of the holy space of the temple. It's, this addition that King Herod made. I see Jesus saying, like, no, this is still holy space. And not only...
So do you think he was inspired by Ezekiel when he did that? I
think it's possible that he was inspired by Ezekiel, that, this whole area is supposed to be a holy place. But I think there's something deeper to it as well. Because we see, after, Jesus drives people off, he speaks to the sellers of doves. What's really interesting to look at Jesus' behavior here as well. It didn't say that he, kicked over the cages and loosed all the doves, because that would have been causing financial harm to these people. And the issue isn't with the sacrificial market. It was an important thing because it was part of the worship.
It's part of it's part of the service at the temple. So why would he be up in arms for service at the temple, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I don't see Jesus taking issue with the actual sacrificial market. I see him taking issue with its location and being relocated from being in a market, elsewhere off of the Temple Mount, but being placed on the Temple Mount itself. And it says he spoke to the sellers of doves and said that this place, my Father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. Right. And so what I see is really happening is that the market had been set up in the court of the Gentiles, the court of the nations. And this is the space that the nations that was designated for the nations to be able to come up and worship. And what had happened is, because of the corruption of the day, the nations were now being prevented from being able to freely worship on the Temple Mount. Their space is now turned into a marketplace, and I feel like that's one of the main issues that he was going against. Like, this is supposed to be a space for the nations, and you're preventing the nations from being able to come here and worship God.
Sure. Well, I would imagine if I were living at the day as a Gentile, that I probably would have a hard time focusing on God's temple if I were in the heart of a marketplace, right? And you see the exchange of the money from the common exchange to the temple currency. You have the animals that you need to bring and purchase for the sacrifices and so on. So I imagine that would probably distract me if I were wanting to approach the God of Israel, right?
Absolutely.
And saying, hey, this is interesting. I want to draw near, right? Because that's really what the temple of God is all about. And so here you have like this wedge, if you will, for the Gentiles with this marketplace.
Right.
So I imagine that would be a very difficult place to draw near to God as an outsider, right?
Right.
So already you're outside. Already you're not really part of everything.
Then you got all this distraction, no space.
So you think Jesus was thinking about these Gentiles who are trying to draw near to Hashem?
I think so. Yeah, because and Jesus there is quoting from Isaiah, where Isaiah says that this is supposed to be this is a house of prayer for all nations, for all peoples, and you're absolutely right about the korban, the sacrifice is about drawing near. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it's something for us as Christians to really understand, because the whole idea of sacrifices is something that we really have a hard time with. We think about animals being slaughtered, and we can kind of get this, knot in the gut of our stomach. We're like, I don't know about all this. But it is a God-ordained form of worship. Sure. And it's important for us as Christians to realize that God ordained this as a form of worship for Him. And it's important for us to realize the purpose of that. It's not like sacrifices aren't about a penalty. It's about drawing close to God, about nearness with God. And you're basically coming to God's house, the house of God, which is, it's symbolic. It's something that we as people can relate to. Is, we have a house. Okay, symbolically, God has a house, the temple. Right. And what do we do when we invite people to our home? We have a meal with them, right? And that's like a core aspect of having fellowship. Right. And that's what we're doing with God. God is inviting people to come to His house, and we're bringing, an offering. We're having a barbecue. Literally. Actually, yeah. Yeah, and a portion of that's going to, going up on the altar to God. A portion of it's being given to the priest. And a portion of that, as the worshiper coming, you take that back and you have your friends and your family and the stranger and the widow, and you have a feast there in the city of Jerusalem, and you worship God. And it's about drawing near to God and drawing near to other people, because we're created in the image of God, and to see that spark of God in other people, and to have that focused around the temple.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you pointed out there. Here's how I explain it to people to try to simplify a very big concept. For one, the sacrifices were never understood as a means for me to have remission of sin, right? Because that's very common. The sacrifice, the animal, the sheep, the goat, whatever, it like, if you will, it covered the sin that I created or that I did. Especially the sins that are that the penalty of them are death, right? The only real, if you're gonna talk about the economy of heaven, so to speak, right? The only real equal value for the sinner is another human, because the animals are of a lower neshama. Right. This is what's taught in Judaism, right? And so, unfortunately, I think in Christianity, you think that, Jews, they depend on the sacrifice, the animal sacrifices to have remission for their sins, and without the temple, they're terrified that their sins are not dealt with and all that kind of thing. Right. So that's one aspect, right? And then you have the other aspect, which is, like you said, they get queasy about the idea of an animal being butchered for the sake of serving it to God, which I say, well, wait a minute. What is it that you do every time you have a hamburger or a hot dog or whatever meat product? An animal had to die, right? Blood was shed. Right. The animal's entrails and everything were taken out. Some are being repurposed and reused. Others are just being tossed away, basically, not being used at all. Unfortunately, some nasty stuff ends up in your hot dog or whatever. If you really want to think it through. And I just tell people, it's funny that to you this is an issue, but to have a barbecue is not. And some get kind of offended about that statement alone, but I'm like, well, think about it, right? The animal is going to be kosherly slaughtered, just like when I have meat here in Israel.
Right.
The same process. The literal only difference is one is offered to God and sanctified. It's
elevated.
It's elevated in its sanctity because now it's been sacrificed to God, right? As part of that relationship of drawing near. And like you pointed out, which is another good point, it's drawing near to others. I think that's important for people to understand in the Christian world, that the temple is a means for tikkun olam, you know, and this is part of the process that God commanded. And to kind of question that is actually really to question God's command in His process of how He deals with us as humans, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the whole. I see the temple is all about bringing people close to God, about encountering God's presence, encountering His love, and being transformed by that love, and having that love transform the world. I really feel like that's the heart of the temple. We even see it in the first command that God gave to build the tabernacle in Exodus 25. God said to build a temple, a tabernacle, so that I can dwell in them.
Correct.
And this is actually in Christianity when we see Paul talking about the Spirit of God, the temple of God dwelling inside of us, we think that that's something distinct from the temple in Jerusalem.
Correct.
But it's not really, because where Paul's actually coming from, that message that Paul is bringing about the temple of God residing in us, or the idea of the inner temple, is actually something that he's quoting from sages. On that very verse, right? Because when God says to dwell among them, the Hebrew betocham, I believe. Yeah, it's about actually just not necessarily. It's translated typically in English as among them, but even better, a better translation for that is inside of them, within. Yes. So the idea is that God wanted to establish the temple so that He could dwell inside each member of the nation of Israel. Correct. And that's the purpose of the temple, is to bring God's divine presence here into earth, and for the nation, for the people, for the followers of God to be able to have that indwelling of His presence in the camp, individually, but collectively as well. Not just individually, but collectively. And it's kind of like, and that collective is something that's really important, that national aspect, and then the individual aspect of that comes afterwards, because as being part of the nation, God is dwelling inside of you.
No, that's a great point, and that's really the core essence of what the purpose of the temple is. Because I ask people who because we discuss this with many Christians all the time, and usually I'll get that statement is, well, I'm the temple of the Holy Spirit. We don't need a temple anymore. We have a high priest in heaven as Jesus. We don't need a temple anymore. Again. And it's almost, it's sad, because it's like, do you realize that what you're saying is you're disqualifying what you're saying at the same time? Right, yeah. Because what you're saying is that the physical doesn't matter, well then therefore what comes afterwards doesn't matter either, right? Right. Because why would Jesus being a priest in heaven have any value if the priest on earth has no value? Right. You follow what I'm saying? Yeah. It's this constant, The
writer of Hebrews even talks about that a little bit.
I'm sure. And this constant clashing of, right, like this excludes this, not realizing it goes together. Right, yeah. So what is the thing about this Jewish concept, right, of me being the temple of God is simple. You can go to the temple, you can offer the sacrifices, you can do everything outwardly and look great. You can be the most religious, God-fearing looking Jew, so to speak, but inside you could have malice, hatred, anger, lust, whatever in yourself, what others can't see. And what it's saying is simple, is you can come to the temple, do everything outwardly, and cross off all your T's and dot all your I's, but not really getting to the heart of the service of the temple. Right. So get yourself right, so to speak, first, so that when you come to the temple, then your sacrifice actually is going to have meaning, right? Because you cleaned your own house first before you come to God's house. It's kind of a simple way to understand that term. In other words, they don't go against each other. I'm the temple of God's Spirit, therefore I don't need God's temple. It's no, because I'm a temple of God's Spirit and I have things in order, now when I come to worship at God's house, everything goes together in harmony.
Yeah, because I know for me, I'm I used to think like that, of like, okay, we have God's temples in me, like the physical temple doesn't really matter. And then I heard a Jewish woman, she said something that really astounded me. She said, every Jew knows that the temple of God dwells inside of us. I was like, what? The word, like, that's what we believe. where are you coming saying that? And she said, and that because we know that God's temple dwells inside of us, or God's presence is in us, that's what gives us a zeal. That's what draws us to God's physical temple in Jerusalem. And that's the beacon within every Jewish soul, every Jewish person that's drawing them back to this place, back to the temple, back to Jerusalem, is because God's temple is in us.
Yeah.
And that hit me very profoundly. Is like, we as Christians have been thinking the same thing as well, in a different, interpreting it differently. But we've lost that piece of like that desire to see that unification of God's presence in the world. And I believe that's what the temple brings. Is we're living in an era, and we have been for many thousands of years since the destruction of the temple. We've been living in an era where God's presence in the world is concealed. We can't see God. We have these arguments. Is God really real? Like, how can this be, right? We have these different arguments. But I believe that the temple, that when God's Shekinah glory, when his divine presence is in the temple, there's no question anymore that God is real. And so I think for us as Christians, that's something that we can get excited about, is standing behind that, of desiring to see God's presence brought into the world. And the Holy Spirit dwelling inside of us should be drawing us to that, to come up to Jerusalem and to see God's presence, God's name established in the world.
For sure. And I think that's another good point there, is God's name, that I think as well is something that in Christian circles I've discovered is lacking, is this the sanctity of the name. And us fighting for that sanctity, to sanctify God's name. In Judaism, the reason why Jews, for example, obey all these commandments, right, is actually because of the sanctity of the name. We want to sanctify God's name in the earth. We want to, through our actions, to invite God into the mundane, into the simple things.
Yeah, we really want to bring a sanctification of God's name, for God's name to be a praise in all the world, right? And Jerusalem is the focal point of that, the epicenter of that taking place. But I'm excited to see that I see things progressively changing, and I think the work of Cry for Zion and other organizations is really helping to affect that change. And I know Cry for Zion's mission is to give Jews the opportunity to pray on their most holy site. It's like basic fundamental freedom of religion. When I first started going up to the Temple Mount, it was pretty, things have changed a lot since when I first went up there. I remember some of the first times going up there, we're going through security. I see Jewish people that are standing in line and they're getting screamed at by police officers before they even get the opportunity to begin ascending up to the mountain. And then once they get up on top of the mountain, they're getting screamed at by Arabs. And I've been up there a few times. I'm a Christian and I bring Christian tour groups up there, but our groups have been mistaken for, some of the women are wearing head coverings and things like that, have been mistaken for a Jewish group by the Muslims up on the mountain. They're screaming and shouting and yelling and throwing things. It's pretty, moving trash cans in front of us, some pretty crazy stuff. But praise God that I've seen a huge change that's happened over the last few years, and a lot of people have been working very diligently to make that change. And one thing that really struck me today, because I just went up on the Temple Mount this afternoon with my wife and daughter, and as I was going up, I spoke with one of the police officers. He recognized me, and a lot of times I usually give my groups an escort when we go up there. So he said, "Do you want an escort today?" I said, "No, I think it's just my wife and I think we'll be okay." So he said, "All right, if you need anything, call me." And it just really struck me how much it's changed in the last 3 years, because, the previous police officers were yelling at Jews. And today, the police are looking at it from a standpoint of really service. He's saying, essentially he's offering protection for the Jewish community to be able to go up there, protecting them from the Muslims and doing it. So it's a huge shift of being like, from an attitude, the police's attitude of the Jews coming up here to visit their most holy place are a burden, to being today being the police are in a place of respecting that and actually providing a service and allowing them to go up to the most holy place. So it's really encouraging to see the change that's taking place.
Of course, it's not perfect. It's not obviously what is right still, but it is encouraging to see that things are moving in the right direction.
Things are moving in a positive direction.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a long ways to go, but
Yeah.
it's good to see the forward progression.
Exactly, and I agree with you. Things are getting better, and hopefully they will continue in that direction, only to improve year by year, and hopefully even sooner than that.
Yeah, for me, I feel, like I mentioned in the beginning, I feel it's fundamental for us to look first at Jesus and his relation to the Temple Mount. And we've kind of done that in our conversation here and seen that it was something that he was very zealous about. God's, his Father's house, as he liked to call it. But I know you mentioned earlier that, Christian theologians say, okay, well, that was Jesus, but after the cross, everything changed, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things I like to do is look at the...
That's how I've heard him explain it, right?
Yeah.
Explain away the Jewishness
of Jesus, yeah.
Of Jesus, so to speak, right?
It's like, oh, well, that was before, and afterwards everything changed. After he, died, was resurrected, the temple became no longer important. And so I thought, okay, well, that is a mainstream Christian thought. Maybe there's some validity to that. So let's take a look at the book of Acts. So that was kind of my next phase, is to look at the book of Acts and see, like, okay, did someone communicate this theology to the disciples?
Right.
And going through the book of Acts, it seems like, if that's the case, that the temple is no longer important, someone apparently miscommunicating that to the disciples of Jesus, because as we begin, even the end of the book of Luke and all throughout the book of Acts, we see, it says that the disciples of Jesus living in Jerusalem were worshiping in the temple daily. They were there every day. And I think one of my favorite just illustrations of how connected the disciples were to the temple is looking at in Acts chapter 2, the day of Shavuot, Pentecost, when God gave the Holy Spirit to the disciples of Jesus. And, traditionally in Christianity, we've been taught that this took place somewhere in the city of Jerusalem in an upper room. But I began looking into, because that's what, is referred to back like 10 or 15 verses in Acts chapter 1. It says they went back and they were in the upper room. But if we go to Acts chapter 2, on the day of Shavuot, there's a lot of things inside the text that actually indicate that they were somewhere else, that they weren't actually in the upper room on that day. And if we look at the context of it, it says the day of Shavuot, the day of Pentecost had fully come. And we know that feast is one of the three feasts that all Jewish men are required to go and present themselves before God in the temple. And so we see it's in the morning on the first day, or on the day of the feast of Shavuot, and we know from Jewish record, from history, that all Jewish men that were in Jerusalem would be in the temple during that time.
Or also those coming from outside, from other nations?
Correct, yes. All the people from other nations would be gathering.
So you have Jews from all the world coming for this high holiday. They have to come to. They have to do aliyah la regel, as we say.
Right, yeah, come up to the holy place. So we have that context of that, the expectation, when we look at the first century context of what's going on here, the expectation is on this morning these men would be in the temple. So we have that to start with. It says that they were gathered together in one accord, and as I understand, that term one accord is actually like an idiom referring to when all the people come together to pray, they're gathering together in one accord, and that's what was taking place in the temples. You had the morning offerings that would be being offered up, and all of the nation of Israel would gather together and people would pray at the same time. We have, referred to other places in the book of Acts, and obviously throughout Jewish history, the hour of prayer, right? In the morning and also in the evening, these set times.
And it says in one, at the place, right?
Yeah, it says they were gathered together in one accord, in one place, or at the place.
The place, yeah.
And that term is like that's a very rich and meaningful term.
If you know the context.
If you know the context of what the place is, hamakom in Hebrew, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the first time we see that phrase is in the book of, as you know, in the book of Genesis, as Abraham is coming up to offer his son Isaac to God.
Yeah.
It says that he lifted his eyes and he saw the place from afar.
Yeah.
And we have in the land of Moriah. Yeah. And so we see it mentioned there. We see it also mentioned with Jacob and other times. But if we go to the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses says that God is going to choose a place to put his name.
Correct.
And that this is where everybody's supposed to, when they come into the land of Israel, God's going to choose the place and they're going to go there. And throughout the book of Deuteronomy, whenever Moses refers to the temple in the land of Israel, he refers to it as the place, that the Lord will choose. And so that term, the place, became synonymous with the temple itself, with the Temple Mount. We even see it with David. He has this zeal, this passion in the Psalms. He says he's not going to rest until he finds the dwelling place for the Lord. So we have this quest to find the place. So that's one of the main ways that the Temple Mount is referred to in the Scripture as the place. And we see that here in the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 1, right there, that they're gathered together in the place. And we see it also says the house. It says that, a little bit later on when it says the house where they were sitting was filled with this mighty rushing wind. The house is also an idiom referring to the temple itself. We know that Yeshua referred to it as his Father's house, and so that's a reference also for the house. And so the way I like to picture it actually happening is the 120 disciples of Jesus that are living in Jerusalem at the time go up to the temple for the worship service in the morning. And they're there gathered together, the 120 disciples of Jesus are on one side, and you got, a group of Jews from Libya on another side, and a group of Jews from Rome over here, and followers of this rabbi over here. They're all kind of packed together in the courtyards of the temple to do their prayers, but they're praying together as a unit, as a body. Sure. And towards the end of the morning prayer service there on Shavuot, all of a sudden the house is filled with this loud rushing wind. And as the disciples are standing in their courts, they're surrounded by all these other groups of Jews from the land of Israel and the nations praying and worshiping. All of a sudden, this great sound rushing wind comes in and flames of fire settle over their heads. And, everybody is all of a sudden looking like, what's going on over there with these disciples of Jesus? What's happening? And, they begin speaking to people. I can just imagine one of the disciples speaking to, a Jew who's come all the way from Libya, and he's speaking to him in his native tongue, or someone from Rome. And this is just a profound impact that takes place on this day. And we see this sudden growth and expansion from the 120 disciples to over 3,000 people that become faithful followers of the Master. And we see, that the book of Acts refers to them not only as followers of Jesus, but also that they were faithful to the traditions, faithful to the commandments. These people were zealous, upright Jews who were following after God.
So Torah observant. Then.
Torah observant, yeah.
So Torah observant Jews who turn their backs on the temple.
No, I don't think we see that.
And stopped sacrificing and basically left the land of Israel and turned their backs on all of that and said, this doesn't matter anymore.
No, that's not the case, because we see, we go to Acts chapter 5 and we see it says that a great number of the priests became followers of the way, became followers of Jesus. And, if a great number of the priests, we don't know what percentage of the priests are, that was. But obviously, if you had a large segment of the priests, began following this strange rabbi and said, oh, he's done away with the temple service, that would have created a lot of disruption to life in the temple, to life in Jerusalem. I would expect to see something of that magnitude recorded in Jewish history. Sure. But we don't see that. And we don't see anything recorded in the book of Acts or in any of the epistles either.
So in other words, it did not create this heresy of this new stream with a new thought, with a new religion. Although, what do you think about, I've also heard that clever theological debates going around and saying, well, you can see that Paul was arrested right when he was about to do his Nazirite vow, right?
Right.
How do you answer that kind of cheeky, so to speak, explanation?
I see that Paul it seems like he was very set on going up to Jerusalem. When he talks back about this later, I believe it's in Acts 26. Anyway, so when later on, Paul says that he was going up to Jerusalem for the intention of bringing tzedakah, for bringing charity, right. And to bring offerings. And some people try and translate that as like, yeah, he was bringing, gifts and charity, and he was also bringing more gifts and charity. But you look at the wording that's used there in Greek, and it is referring to the sacrifices. So Paul says that he came up to Jerusalem with the intention of bringing offerings, of making right. offerings in the temple. And on his way there, he had taken, sometime along the way, he had taken this Nazirite vow. Right. We don't know, at least it appears like that, right? It says that he cut off his hair, and then then we see in the context, when he finally gets to Jerusalem and he ends up meeting with James, And, the whole context there, James saying, there's some brothers that are saying that you're teaching people not to follow the ways of God, the law, the Torah. You and I both know that that's not the case. And so I know that you're here to complete this Nazirite vow. We have some other men that are also wanting to take this Nazirite, or are at the time for completing their Nazirite vow, pay for their offerings as well. And so we see Paul readily agrees. He doesn't there's no, argument. He doesn't argue about it at all. It's like perfectly in line with his intention in coming up there. He's bringing charity for the community of believers in Jerusalem. And maybe part of that charity was being able to pay for, these guys who are also needing to complete a Nazirite vow. I find it really interesting when you go back to number 7 and you see what's entailed with those sacrifices for the Nazirite vow. You see sin sacrifices in there. So there's sin offerings. So it's very interesting to see that,
Sure.
Paul comes, this is 20-something years or more after Yeshua has, resurrected. And here Paul is coming into the temple and to offer sacrifices, including sin sacrifices.
Sure. And that's an important fact, I think, for people to understand. And let's just say, hypothetically, Paul was saved by, I forget where I read some theologian write, that the Holy Spirit sent these guards to arrest him and to keep him from his fault, to kind of save him and deliver him from this faulty action he was about to commit by bringing up the sacrifices. Let's just hypothetically, believe that, right? Well, then how come is it that we forget about the other 4 Jews that he pays for their sin sacrifice and all the many other sacrifices that were brought up? And that's why I say it's a mitzvah, because what he's doing is he's being advised to basically do a mitzvah. And one thing we know, at least from the records of the book of Acts, like you pointed out, those men obviously continued with their vow. Right. They weren't arrested, at least not that's recorded.
Right.
So what about them? What about the rest of the early church? What about all of Yaakov's followers and disciples?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so if he advised Paul to do that, what? Then he didn't advise the rest of them? In order to agree with this theology that Christians are teaching, you literally have to say that the brother of Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right. And that's a very, I would really caution people against bringing that type of accusation against the brother of Jesus. This is the man who, afterwards, it seems like he's kind of taken that steward role for the house of David. He's given an elevated. He wasn't one of the 12 apostles, but it seems like he's given a position within the 12, and maybe even at a certain elevated position, being the brother of Jesus. And he was somebody that all of the apostles respected. Yeah. Paul came, submitting his gospel message to the authority of James. And that's one of the things that Paul was doing during this trip, is to submit his gospel message to James to see, am I teaching the truth? Right. That's one of the things that was taking place there. So Paul definitely respected James. The other disciples did, and we know that James, from Jewish record, we know that James was somebody in early church history record that James was somebody who was highly, highly respected. Sure. To the point where, there's a legend that he was actually allowed into the Holy of Holies where only the high priest is. And we can assume that's probably not the case, sure, that he went into the Holy of Holies. But that's how revered James was among the believers. There's even a recording of him at the end of James is one of the martyrs that we have a church record of his death. And we know that the Jewish leaders came to him saying that, hey, people are going astray, following your brother as the Messiah. We know that you're a righteous man and that nothing but truth proceeds from your mouth. And we want you to stand up and tell the people the truth. They didn't even ask him what he was going to say. They just knew that he was such a righteous person that they could trust in what he said. And he stood up and he delivered the message saying that Jesus is the way. And then that's the point where they stood him up on the pinnacle of the temple because they wanted him to be able to proclaim that message out. And some people came up and shoved him over. They're like, we've done a very dangerous thing. We didn't even ask him what he was going to say before he went up there. But that's how revered James was. Yeah. And then when he said that, people, a few rowdies went up there and pushed him over. And when he fell down, he also, and it's interesting that James is standing at the place and he gets pushed down from the same place that the devil took Jesus to in Matthew chapter 4 and tempted him to cast himself down from here. So it's kind of maybe ironic. It's interesting to see that point. That's where his brother died. And as James fell down, they began stoning him. And it says that one of the priests, one of the descendants of Rechab, who's mentioned in one of the descendants of, who the Rechabites were a priestly family that received a special covenant from God, and the book of Jeremiah talks about it. And a priest of the order of Rechab was standing before the people, stopping them from trying to prevent them from killing James. And as James is lying there he survived the fall. And as he's laying there praying, he's praying that, God, they don't know what they're doing. Don't hold this to their charge. So the priest was like, don't you realize the righteous one is even now as he's dying and you're trying to kill him, he's interceding for you.
Wow.
And so that's who James was, as someone who was, they say his knees were like camels because he was always praying, an intense man of God.
Yeah, that's a very interesting record, because I also know, in Judaism, he's called, in the Jewish records, he's called Yaakov HaTzadik, Yaakov the righteous. And I think it's important to understand for your Christian audience, first of all, what does a tzaddik mean? That's not something that's not a title, because first of all, it's a title. It's not a title that's handed out to anybody. It's not like, the title of rabbi. Okay, many Jews have the title of rabbi, actually. I run into a lot of Christians that keep saying, yeah, I met this rabbi, and I know that most likely they mean an Orthodox Jew. It's like, yeah, sure, he's not most likely a rabbi, but let's just say. But at the same time, there are many rabbis, actually. Again, to take a very big subject and to squeeze it down, it's that a tzaddik is one who has emptied themselves of themselves and are basically God, right? In other words, filled with holiness. Yeah, filled with, so they've emptied themselves so much of themselves, so to speak, that really their action, their practice, what they do is godliness, right? It's truth, right? And so to reach that level and to get that label, it's not something you just get because you had a few followers and you were renowned in Jerusalem, etc. Even Jesus, as far as I know, doesn't get the title of tzaddik, actually, in any record that I've ever read. But interestingly enough, it's the brother of Jesus who does.
Wow.
Yet this is the man, right, who gave his life up for the temple, I would say. Yeah. Again, when you study the record, like you pointed out, obviously he was a Temple Mount faithful Jew. Right, yeah. He was renowned or respected by many of the Jews in Jerusalem. And yes, unfortunately, we had a corruption at the time. Yeah. We had people who bought into the priesthood, who were politically motivated, not religiously motivated per se. Yeah. And a lot of corruption came in, and a lot of unfortunate bloodshed in that period. And unfortunately, that's how many Christians also view Judaism as a whole, is from that prism, and not understanding that Judaism is stuck in the Second Temple period. And thank God we've moved on. Thank God we don't. Yeah. That's not our practice.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's really profound to me about when I look at Jesus' message and I look at the message of his disciples. Is, a big part of their message was this message of love, about connecting people to God, connecting to God and his unconditional love. We see it replete throughout Paul's writings and others. And I think when a lot of times when we look at the message of Jesus, we see that message of love. And it's really interesting to look at what was going on during that day. Because, what was it, 40 years or so after Yeshua died, the temple was destroyed. And when the sages of Israel, when the people of Israel look back at that period in time and they say, why was the temple destroyed? The temple was obviously destroyed for some type of sin. What was that sin? They say that the sin is baseless hatred. Right. And it's really powerful, I think, for us as Christians to realize that was the issue, one of the core issues, this corruption, this baseless hatred, this hatred that brother had against brother, that was existing, unfortunately, during this era. We had this kind of this era of false religion, or at least to a certain extent, some people were walking in this, and it was a real issue. And Yeshua's message, Jesus' message, was directly confronting this baseless hatred, and he was addressing that, bringing a message of unconditional love. And so we, as his followers, that's our mantle to take up, is to take up the mantle of walking in his footsteps, walking in unconditional love, treating other people in that way. And it's something that we have the opportunity to lead in and to do, to live in our daily lives. And I think it's not until we get to that level of applying the teachings that Jesus had, of that unconditional love, of loving our brothers as ourselves, that I believe is the key to being able to enter into the new age. In order for God's presence to be brought back here on the earth, we have to correct that sin of baseless hatred. And the teachings of Jesus outline how to do that. Also the teaching of the sages since then as well. But that Yeshua in that point in time was bringing that very clear message. That was something that was very much needed for the generation. He was really a prophet that was bringing a message to prevent the destruction. But the people didn't listen.
Yeah.
And so it's important for us, is the Jewish sages say that, from what I've heard, is that every generation that doesn't see the rebuilding of the temple is guilty of its destruction. So that means that if we're not seeing that restoration take place, it means that sin is still within us. And so that's our job, is to prepare our hearts for God to come.
There's another saying that says that when you study and learn about the temple, it's as if you rebuilt it. And that's part of our goal with Cry for Zion, is education, for the purpose and the goal of spiritually rebuilding that temple. As you study measure the measurements, understand the importance, the sanctity. Why does it have to be these many cubits? Why do we have to have an altar? Why do we have to have lampstand, showbread, etc., 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 right? So when you study those things, it's as if you built the temple. And I think that to me is an encouragement when we educate about the temple, that in a way that's us putting that building block after building block towards the hopefully one day seeing the temple of God restored.
Wow,
and
that's really powerful.
And God's Spirit being able to again dwell within Israel, right? And then also by God's grace and according to the prophets, it will be a house of prayer for all nations. And so in the same time, it will also emanate into the nations as well, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I would like to encourage and challenge your Christian audience out there, who, especially those who, very zealously believe that they are the temple of God. I would encourage you that, it's really only to the extent that you understand the physical temple and the deep meaning behind that you'll be able to really understand what it means to be the temple of God, to have God's presence dwelling in you. The way that every intricate detail, the reason why God went into so much detail in building the temple, he didn't go into enough detail for us to be able to physically build it. There's additional detail that was passed on orally to the Jewish people on how to do that. But everything that was recorded was with intention, and it's something that we can model our lives off of. Why was the temple just so enclosed with gold? If you go into the Holy of Holies, it's like the inside, it's enclosed with gold, and then you look at the Ark of the Covenant, wrapped in gold, inside and outside. It's part of it is showing us the great value of God's word and what He's given to us there in the Torah and the Ten Commandments that are within that, because gold is probably the most valued resource within humankind, right? It's our basis for money, at least historically for millennia. It's a thing that we really value. And God doesn't need all of that gold around the temple, right? He commanded for that to be there for us to understand, just as like we would put the value of that, billions of dollars of gold inside that room, to say that, His word, His Torah, the Ten Commandments are so much more valuable than all of that gold.
Yeah.
It's an illustration for us.
Exactly. It's not literal because obviously God doesn't dwell in the temple.
Right.
He doesn't need a temple.
No.
The command is to build it for him to dwell within us, not within it.
Right.
And so that's an important fact, I think, for the Christian audience to understand. Because, the Jewish people don't have this burning desire to build a house for God because he needs one.
Right. It's because we need one.
Because we need one.
We need it.
We need it. Literally, we need it.
We need it.
It's tikkun olam. It's the outpouring of God's presence and his eminence into the earth, into Israel, through Israel, to the world.
Right.
And that's the joy of the whole earth. That is what it's all about. That's the core, to me at least, of why it's so important for us to educate Christians about the Temple Mount, so that they can be involved in that house of prayer for all nations. Because let's be real, because people always, many times will criticize and question, well, why the Christians, blah, blah, don't you know the history? And they've been so bad to the Jews. And I'm like, first of all, you're right. And I'm fully aware of the awful history of Christianity and Judaism. That's there. Unfortunately, that doesn't represent Christianity when you look at the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus, etc., like you just pointed out. That was a political movement that used the religious, slogans and so on to kind of help push their political movement, which we know has been used many times in many countries all over the world to do the same. And unfortunately, then people have this bad stigma towards a religion or an organization or whatever. But really, the reason why I see Christianity being a key player in this end time scenario of a house of prayer for all nations is because I don't see any other religious entity out there that would connect to the house of God like the people of Israel. Because no other religion really has its birthing out of the people of Israel like the Christian people do. Islam has somewhat, but it's just totally not the same. It doesn't see itself as in fellowship with Israel together. It sees itself as its own religion to trump the others and do away with the others, right?
Yeah.
And so, and again, it's not to bash Islam, but I'm just saying as an example, why Christianity? It's a good question. Why not Islam? Well, that's why not Islam. Why Christianity? Well, because Christianity, for those who care about the roots of Christianity, will see that their roots are in Israel or in the Jewish faith. And that is where I see the house of prayer for all nations being manifested. Mostly from Christians coming from around the world, having that aha moment of, oh, the temple of God matters. It's important. And we need to flock to it. Like you said, the Spirit of God needs to lead us there so that we can receive of the blessing of God, of His presence, that I pray one day will be manifested again on His holy mountain.
Amen. Yeah. And that's what I'm really excited about. I'm observing that there's an awakening happening within the Christian world of people. God's touching people's hearts with a heart for His heart, with zeal for His house, with the desire to understand and know more about it. And it's a really exciting thing that's taking place. And I feel like that even goes into the core, purpose of building the temple, or even that first command for the nation of Israel to build a temple for God. It's a unique command in that it's not a mitzvah that one individual can do, or 10 individuals can do, or 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 even. It's something that the entire nation of Israel has to come together in unity in order to do that. And we're in a season now where it's the season of turning hearts, about hearts turning back to God and His will and His desire. I think it's even more than just the nation of Israel's hearts turning. I think it requires the hearts of the nations to turn as well. And I really believe that if we in the nations really understood what the temple would mean for us, what the temple would mean for somebody living in South Africa, or for someone living in New Zealand or Papua New Guinea, or Denver, Colorado, where I come from. If we really understood the significance of the temple and how profoundly it would transform our world, everybody would come here right now and demand that it would be restored.
I think so. So by God's grace, you'll be successful in your mission, and so will we. Thank you so much for this interview. I think this was really great. We were able to delve into some really good stuff here. And in fact, if you have any other important things that you wanted to kind of throw in there, this is the time to do it.
Yeah, and my heart's desire is to see Christians in the nations just grab a hold of God's vision. To grab a hold of really Jesus' passion. We see that the temple and the Temple Mount was something that Jesus was zealous for at a very high level. It says that he was consumed with that. And so what I long for is to see more of his disciples consumed with a zeal like he was consumed, and to be transformed by that love of God. And as that love of God transforms us, that it would transform the world and bring the whole world together into the kingdom of God.
Well, Aaron Murphy, I appreciate the interview. I think this was going to really help open a lot of people's minds.
Thank you very much for having me today.
And I wish you all the best.